Okay, I would like to welcome folks to our session today on difficult and charged conversations.
We have a very short amount of time, so we didn't want to belabor introductions or things focused on us as facilitators, but we did think it was important for you to know who was in the room and how we come to this space of thinking about difficult or challenging conversations. So I am Josh Bookin. I'm the Associate Director of Instructional Support and Development at the Graduate School of Education. And I come to challenging conversations as both a teacher, as an instructional coach. At Harvard, when I was teaching economics for public policymakers at the Kennedy School, a lot of difficult conversations rose up, and I struggled to have the skills to be able to hold that space. And so I've learned more about that, and as a coach, I've been able to do that one-on-one with faculty, and then also hold conversation spaces and longer learning communities that address the types of topics that we're working with today. And I'll pass it to Katie.
Hi, everyone. I'm really happy and grateful to be here. My name is Katie Reiser. I'm a lecturer at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and I work in the teacher education programs there. So I work with pre-service teachers who are about to enter the classroom. It's hard to work with teachers who are trying to learn how to have conversations about race and racism specifically, or just difficult conversations in general with K-12 students without finding myself facilitating lots of those tough conversations with the pre-service teachers themselves. So the bulk of my experience with this work has been as a facilitator in a classroom space with folks who want to be teachers. And then outside of the classroom space, I've done a little bit of specifically race and racism professional development for faculties, for groups of teachers. So I have a little bit of experience with those topics, specifically working with folks who are teaching and in the classroom every day, but I'm grateful to be here. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sheehan Scarborough. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I currently serve as Senior Director for the Harvard Foundation for Intercultural and Race Relations in the Dean of Students Office at the college. For me, this work is incredibly important right now. There's a real emphasis, as I think everyone in the country is aware of, on race. And these can be challenging conversations that I think people are sometimes afraid to have. And my hope in every conversation that I have with students or in supporting those who are leading these conversations is helping folks get to a point where they feel comfortable leaning into that discomfort. I really think that's important. And especially right now, from my experience as a residential proctor for first-year students, I remember clearly what it was like the night of the election in 2016, facilitating those conversations. And I'm anticipating the challenge of those conversations again, but looking forward to it as an opportunity too. Again, there are learning moments in all of these conversations. So I'm really happy to be here as well.
And my name is Sotoshed. I work with Katie as a lecturer in education, and I train predominantly social studies and history teachers at the Graduate School of Education. I'm also the co-lead on two projects, one around developing and teaching civic expertise, and another around personalized learning in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space. And so really all three spheres of my work have really called upon really thinking thoughtfully about how we can train others and lead ourselves difficult conversations. And so this is something where I say I have an emerging expertise, but just a ton of experience of trying to figure out something really hard. And I think that's what I can bring to today. So our motivating question, this is sort of our goals for today, the things we want to explore. How do we create valuable opportunities to push and challenge our students? How can we facilitate learning and mitigate harm in moments of conflict? And what changes if these conversations are happening in the online space? Okay, and I should say that we're bringing this with an eye towards both the classroom and sort of just meetings among colleagues and peers as well. So our agenda, we've pretty much walked through most of our getting started. And in a moment, my colleague Katie will introduce sort of the framework and strategies that we're going to dig in today. We'll spend most of our time today really sort of applying and exploring in small groups where we'll look at a case study to really bring some thinking and some thought to these issues. And then we'll sort of close up with just summarizing some key points and also pointing you to some resources to extend your learning. Finally, I just want to introduce some norms before we get started. And as you're looking over these norms, if you have any questions about what these look like to enact and you're not sure, just please message the host and we'll follow up with you. But one, we want folks to stay engaged. We recognize that this is a long day. And so for some of us, we have other things going on in work, but we're really looking at a lot of peer-to-peer learning happening. So not only for your own sake, but for your colleagues to stay engaged. It's going to require you to experience some discomfort. And so feel okay with that and do that. Expect and accept non-closure. So we're going to be raising a lot of questions, and you might leave here with some really rich questions and a few answers, but probably more questions. And then last but not least, let's really invite people to share. And so we do that with this idea that we'll have confidentiality here.
One thing just to say as we go into the next piece is we're going to change the chat right now to host only for questions and things that you want to communicate to us, but so we don't try to have two different channels that you need to attend to.
So I'm going to turn it over now to Katie, and she's going to introduce some of the frameworks and strategies for today.
So, we really wanted to start to ground our conversation about difficult conversations in some clear frameworks. And before I introduce the two frameworks that we're going to use today, I'll first say that all frameworks are kind of inherently flawed, and anytime you're doing kind of critical thinking or complex work, or as complex as facilitating difficult conversations in the classroom, a framework is necessarily going to be imperfect. And so we encourage you to bring and leverage your own experience and expertise into these conversations, even as you try to leverage these frameworks. They're not intended to be, okay, step A, step B, step C, but instead are supposed to sort of guide your own thinking and allow you to leverage what you know already to try to, have conversations that maximize learning and, mitigate harm. So the first framework that we'll mention is the Teaching Tolerance Let's Talk Guide to Critical Conversations. This is easily accessible online, and it's a long document that distills critical conversations into 4 specific steps. The first one is doing self-work, or understanding what your positionality and experience in it is as you come into having critical conversations in classroom or other spaces. The second is to sort of build community and discussion routines into your classroom. So before having any conversations that are difficult, building in norms into a community and making a space feel safe enough for these conversations. Then you want to sort of plan a conversation, particularly as Sheehan was mentioning, the election or around conversations that will be difficult. Putting thought and planning in on the front end is crucially important. And finally, there's facilitating the conversation. Sometimes these conversations happen because we've planned them out carefully, or because a class is explicitly oriented toward a particular topic. But a lot of times a student just says something and you go, whoa, I'm not really sure how to respond to that. And that's what our focus is going to be, on in our session today. We've developed what we're calling the Reflective Action Facilitation Framework in order to try to help you all conceptualize and integrate, again, the experience and knowledge that you're already bringing to these conversations. And again, our entire framework is based in the teaching tolerance framework, in that last step of actually facilitating or having the conversation. So a moment happens in class, and a difficult conversation is needed because of what happened, whether it's an incident with a student or something you just want to bring up. How do you go about having the conversation? Our framework also has 4 parts, and there's going to be a much more detailed and complete handout that you'll get in a minute. But I just want to walk you through what those 4 parts are, and then say 2 things about how you might understand or view the framework. So the first step is to name and frame the incident out loud to the group that you're working with. Just name what happened. The second step is really 2 steps combined into one. And the reason why we combined it 2 steps into one is because sometimes you're going to want to lead with curiosity in a difficult conversation, and other times you're going to want to lead with redirection. And the question of which you lead with, and whether or not you have a curious conversation in which you're engaging with a student or a colleague who made a particular comment, or whether you just sort of name that something was inappropriate or caused harm, all depends on who's a part of the group, what the comment was, what the context is, and what you're bringing into the space. And so we kind of pair those together, because sometimes you'll want to choose curiosity in order to engage in a difficult conversation. Other times you'll want to lead with a redirection if, say, you think harm was done and you want to mitigate that quickly. And sometimes you're going to want to do a combination of both. And again, that's about your professional judgment. The third step in our framework is to, again, a choice point, to go deeper with either reflection or response. So again, sometimes you're going to want to ask people to do personal or group reflection on an incident that happens or a difficult conversation that you're having. And other times you're going to want to just respond out loud to the incident that happens. You're going to want to take more authority or more control over the classroom space in order to keep that space safe enough for learning to happen later. And finally, we encourage you to provide some closure and name some next steps. And so the note over there at the side, it basically just reiterates that you may not use all of those steps in every difficult conversation. It's certainly not a checklist, and it's not a order of operations, but it's a series of choice points and a way to frame your own thinking about difficult conversations as you come in and start to practice having them with students consistently.
Now we're going to get into a chance to digest that framework a bit more fully and also to apply it, at least get our first chance to think through applying it. And so what we're going to do is we're going to have case discussions, although there's a lot of folks here and that could have pointed towards a webinar. We thought there's no way to have a session on difficult conversations without really getting into it and having a give and take and thinking through this and experiencing it not just with your head, but also with your heart and with your emotions really involved. So we tried to pick something that we hoped would do that. And so we have a caselet that's going to put you in the shoes of a professor. And I know we're not all instructors here, but a center of gravity of what brings us together is thinking about classroom practice. And so it's going to invite you to apply specifically that second framework that Katie was talking about, the reflective action facilitation. And so the groups are going to be, we said 3 to 4, I think we're going to expand that to be 4 to 5. And we're going to have us as facilitators, the 4 of us are going to pop in to listen periodically. Please don't talk to us, keep talking to each other. We just want to get a sense of what's happening in the rooms. I would love it if you spend about half of your time discussing analysis questions, and you're going to see what those are in a minute, and about half of the time discussing action questions. I took a great class with Ron Heifetz about adaptive leadership, and his take was we jump way too quickly into action and we don't spend enough time diagnosing and analyzing and understanding. Someone asked about confidentiality. Is this being recorded? So this part is being recorded, the whole group part, which is mostly us sharing with you all. The small groups are not going to be recorded at all. And that's where hopefully we can get into more of what you actually think and maybe putting yourself out there. So that will be confidential. We ask that it is confidential for you all, and it definitely won't be recorded. So what we're going to have you do in just a minute is take a few minutes to read the second page of the handout. And that is the case and the discussion instructions. We're then going to have time for any of you to type clarifying questions in the chat. And I'll hopefully address those that would be helpful for us before we go into the groups. And then page 1 of this handout is reflective action facilitation framework. So you can read sort of in a bit more depth and refer to what Katie just said. So the bit.ly is now going to appear on the screen, and we're also just dropped it in the chat. And now just take 3 or so minutes to read page 2. Let us know if you have any clarifying questions, and then we're going to populate folks into the breakout rooms and get going into the discussion.
All right. Hi, everyone. It sounds like some really great breakout sessions in the past 20 minutes. And I think all 4 of us, we want to thank you for participating in those breakouts and for leaning into that discomfort. We know that the case was not an easy one. I think we chose it for exactly that reason. There's a lot to debrief here, right? We're not going to get to everything in the next 10 minutes, but I do want to lift up some of what I think is important and may feel unresolved for you after coming from those breakout sessions. I think it's important right from the get-go to acknowledge that what may be a considered experience as a pain point for someone is not necessarily a pain point for someone else. So we don't want to give the impression that there's a universality to what's considered a difficult conversation, right? In a community as diverse as ours, people are coming in with different experiences, varying levels of familiarity with American politics and American history. And right now we're living through a moment where there's a hyper-focus on America, race, and our internal divisions. And the sensitivities of certain topics can pose a challenge to those without that level of awareness of where those sensitivities lie. And so that's really why we wanted to, in this scenario, signal that this is an international student. We don't know where this student is, but part of the feedback that you're getting in this scenario is, the student has shared, there's this real focus on the American context. And perhaps the student is finding difficulty entering into that conversation. And yet, here is the student engaging with a topic that could feel like it has a very particular national significance right now. So there's an opportunity here too. But I think we want to be mindful that our community is diverse and there are many perspectives on what's considered challenging for one person may not be for another. which is why this first pivot point, naming and framing, is so important. For those of us facilitating these conversations, that first step is really about identifying what's going on for you, scanning the room, or the screen in this case, engaging what may be going on for the folks in the room, getting a temperature check. Framing in particular is important, and I want to emphasize that here. Acknowledgement, being able to acknowledge what may be happening and framing it in a way that invites that sustained engagement, at the very least shows that you have an awareness of how this might be landing for people, that you have a sensitivity to what your students may be experiencing, even if they're not yet vocalizing it, which can raise your credibility as someone who's going to attempt to steer this conversation carefully. And I just want to say, time and time again in my conversations with students, including on the night of the election in 2016 that I mentioned before, in the midst of these challenging conversations, students respect when those challenges are named, when we're not just barreling through the topic like it's a complete abstraction, right? But recognizing that it has very real lived consequences for people. And in this case, we're talking about African Americans and the Jewish population. That allows for us to pivot to this next step, right? Engaging with curiosity or redirection. And what sounds like was coming up for some of you in the breakout sessions was, well, how do you know which it is, right? Is it curiosity, or is it addressing the harm, redirecting, maybe pulling the conversation back a little bit? I want to say this is a delicate dance, and it is a choice point, because remember, we're trying to lean into the challenge, right? We're leaning into that learning opportunity while also mitigating harm. So I want to take a moment and go back specifically to what this student has said, and I'm going to read it. So the student, this is what they're asking. I don't understand why African Americans haven't been able to turn things around. Really, they should have been able to. Other groups have experienced significant trauma, recovered from it, and done well for themselves. For example, Jews experienced the Holocaust. That's a lot. In any moment, when that happens in the room, that's a lot to unpack. And I want to acknowledge that and just share, we've all been in those situations where you're not quite sure what the best next thing is to say. But again, it is important to say something. It is important to acknowledge that this could be challenging for folks. And here's what I believe, that this is actually a chance to both engage with curiosity and do some redirection. For example, what I might say is, I'm hearing you asking for understanding, right? I'm hearing in your question a desire for greater understanding, and I'd like to invite everyone into this conversation to the extent that you feel able to contribute. And I'm also going to encourage everyone to stay present. I want to take your question on face value, but also acknowledge that in America, what we call the oppression Olympics, the comparing one group of people alongside of another, has been used really as a divisive tactic, right? To take attention away from the lived experiences of a particular group in order to say, well, if this group can do it, everyone should be able to pull themselves up by the bootstraps. But we want to be more specific than that, and let's use this opportunity to bring some data to explore a little bit more about where you're coming from with this question. And I know that that's not easy to do, right? It's not easy to have all of that language available at once as you're trying to navigate through this conversation. But again, it is important to begin inviting that curiosity. And I'll say, it's fair to be able to ask the student, where's that coming from? What resources are you drawing on? Can you be more specific when you say African Americans haven't been able to turn things around? What things, right? And also for the redirection, why don't we set aside the comparison and set aside the should or should have language and try to get towards deeper understanding about what specifically it is that you're asking. Some folks mentioned, finally, I want to make a few observations about the virtual element. The reality is that for some, it's really difficult right now to stay fully engaged, to stay fully present, and to be vulnerable virtually, right? And I think you'll want to factor this in with your groups as you're deciding on those community norms at the beginning of the conversation. At the same time, going into, when you're getting the sense that this is going to be a challenging conversation, I think it's completely appropriate to take a pause and to name that, and also say, can we commit to one another to really being present right now? So I'm inviting everyone to set aside some distractions. Let's give this some attention. We're not going to resolve this question or this challenge in the moment, but let's try to stay engaged virtually to the extent that we all can. Technical trouble is inevitable. Like, I think even in this conversation that we're having now, there have been a few moments where we've dropped off the call, been muted, not been able to get in and out of breakout rooms. That's the reality of this moment. What I would encourage is asking the class or considering in conversation, how do we want to show up if there is that moment when someone has a technical challenge? And also making sure to hold the space that if someone's in the middle of speaking, acknowledge that they may have been interrupted and make space for that person when they return to continue that thought. Again, also providing alternatives for people to engage. If someone's not able to vocalize, can you make the chat available for folk to be able to contribute their thoughts here? That also may work better for some people who feel that they don't quite have the words in the moment and want to do a little bit of journaling, right? And we talk about this a little bit in that third pivot point, going deeper with reflection and or response, giving people a chance to process what's happening in the conversation, write some specific feelings or thoughts that they're having, and come back being able to speak from that place of a little bit more confidence. So with all of this, there's so much that came up with the conversation. I want to acknowledge that even now, we're not resolving all that might feel unresolved with this difficult case, but we are available past this conversation. We have some additional resources for you to follow up with yourselves. And I want to encourage all of you to lean into these conversations, continue showing up to programs like this. The more of us who feel comfortable and able to facilitate these conversations, the better off we're going to be, because we're in a time where there is a real profound divisiveness in our discourse. And I think places like Harvard is exactly where we should be able to have community conversations around difficult topics. I'm going to pause there and I'm going to turn it back over to my colleague.
Great. We're going to conclude. We just want to hear from you all. So we have a prompt here for you to share in the chat. What is one key learning that you're walking away with? And this could be a takeaway. This can also be a new question that's emerged for you or a deeper question that you have. But what's one key learning that you're walking away with? Please take a moment and share with us in the chat.
A lot of great things rolling in here, and it feels like a lot of people are just starting with the start, which is a good thing, about pausing, breathing, noticing your own reactions, naming and framing. So it feels like, and I've often found when I'm really nervous about something, if I can get the first step to be in a better spot, a lot of the other things start to take care of themselves more. So I think it's great for us to be grounded in that beginning piece. A lot of people are even backing it up and talking about the other things you do before in terms of norms. And then people are really resonating with the flow chart, both this framework and then I think just having a framework, as Katie said, it's never going to be perfect, but having a place to start from and think from can ground us. And especially when we ourselves are activated and a little bit on tilt, that can help us, especially with repetitions of it, to have some places that we can go to that we know we're making a pretty solid decision, even if we're not thinking in our clearest.
Right. So if we can move to our last slide, I'm going to close this out right on time. We just want to come back and emphasize that we did a ton of work today about facilitating the conversation, but it's really about a much broader approach, right? And so this overall approach that we want to emphasize is the importance of doing the self-work for yourself in terms of, what am I comfortable with? What am I not comfortable with? What is the language I have? What is the language I need to develop? But really preparing and thinking about yourself as someone that is going to both participate and lead these conversations. Building up the community ahead of time, both in terms of norms and discussion routines, planning the conversation intentionally when you can. And you definitely should be asking yourself, am I planning difficult conversations? That's something that, to borrow Sheehan's language, that I want to lean into and really begin to sort of surface, because we know they're happening all around us. And last but not least, the real deep work we did today that you all did with the cases, how do you facilitate these conversations once they come up? the importance of naming and framing, then engaging or deciding to go to redirect. How do we go deeper and respond? And finally, many of us were getting to how do we think about closure and next steps. So again, this was just a highlight. I think you all really dug into this today pretty deeply, and we hope this is something that you continue to grow. Josh, any words on resources?
Yeah, just to close it out, we would love to keep providing, as Sheehan said, being resources to you. So one is that you can feel free to reach out to any of us. And our emails will be on the final slide in a sec. But we're also going to share these slides. We're going to share the handout for anyone who didn't get it or just wants to be able to access it again. There's the teaching tolerance link to that resource that Eric talked about that we've all found really useful. And then two colleagues of mine, Allison Pingree and Catherine Farrar, created a great curated tip sheet about teaching in times of strife and trauma. So it's talking about difficult conversations in moments like this moment, both racial reckoning, politics, pandemic. So hopefully those things will all be of use to you. There are emails to get in touch as you are moved. And it's just been really a pleasure to be able to hold this space with you all. And I wish you the best in all that is easy and all that is difficult.
Thank you, everybody.